We return now to a story I brought you last night of this 13-year-old Syrian boy, Hamza Ali al-Khatib. He was brutally tortured and murdered, his body bullet-ridden and even castrated. Hamza's death is turning into a rallying cry on Syria's streets, a symbol of the uprising. Well, today the Syrian government responded with their version, trying to undo the, and I quote, lies and false accounts spread by the foreign press. They didn't kill Hamza, they didn't torture him. They even dragged out Hamza's father and uncle on state TV to call President Bashar al-Assad the best president ever. Remarkable. For more on this, I'm joined by two esteemed veteran diplomats. Anne-Marie Slaughter was until recently Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. She's now at Princeton University. And with me here is Jamie Rubin, former Assistant Secretary of State. He's also the Executive Editor of the Bloomberg View, which just published an editorial on America's limited options now in Syria. Welcome to you both. Jamie, let me start with you first. You're right here. Does this event crystallize the public's opposition to Assad and jeopardize him, or does it mean he will go to no ends to suppress the revolution?
I think it's both. I think the people will be outraged. I don't think they will believe the father saying today that Bashar Assad is a great president. I think they will believe what happened yesterday. These crude attempts to turn things around don't convince anybody. So I think it will be a rallying cry. The problem is these equations, Elliot, we've been talking about this since the Arab Spring began. How many of the security services are prepared to shoot and kill their fellow countrymen, and in this case, torture them? And there are thousands, tens of thousands of Syrian security forces prepared to do that. And then how many people on the other side prepared to face that kind of brutal attacks on the streets or in the jails or elsewhere? And unfortunately, right now, that balance, unless there are suddenly hundreds of thousands that come out in Syria, favors this brutal regime.
So, Anne-Marie, let me turn to you. Make a prediction. Does the brutality that the Assad regime has shown, does it in fact lead people to leave the street, or does it lead to marches, some of which we saw yesterday, of kids, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids in the streets saying this brutality is too much? Play this out for us based on what you think the State Department understands about Syrian culture. What happens over the next week or two?
Elliot, I think this really breathes new life into the protests. The protests started with the arrest and torture of a group of 10 to 15-year-old boys. So it started around the willingness to torture children, and the visuals of the horrific atrocities committed against this 13-year-old child really do crystallize the rage and the injustice of a government that is willing to do anything to stop its people, and then is lying about it. And I think we move here from the war of words to facts. This picture cannot be denied. They can say whatever they want, but the fact is the world is seeing this picture. You had a president and a first lady of this country that have two young children of their own. The juxtaposition of what they say and what they're willing to do, I think, is going to breathe new life into the streets. We're seeing people with incredible bravery saying enough. And we don't know whether it will be enough to overcome, as Jamie says, the tens of thousands of security forces, but there's a whole new chapter here.
Look, of course, the question that irks and troubles any United States citizen is that we have not yet done anything tangible, palpable to assist those who are revolting against Assad's horrendous rule. So the question is, beyond the outrage expressed by Secretary Clinton very palpably, powerfully yesterday, what can we do? And in fact, the rule seems to be, if you're a Mubarak and you've been our ally, we push you out with a few words. And yet with Assad and Gaddafi to a lesser extent, we seem to have limited choices. So, Jamie, what can we do? What should we do right now about Syria?
Well, each of these cases, Egypt, Libya, and Syria that you mentioned, are different for a whole bunch of reasons. I obviously won't get into all of them. But in Syria, our options are quite limited for a lot of reasons. Number one, the security forces are still in charge. There is no rebel security force fighting it the way there was in Libya. Number two, the kind of thing we did in Libya, air power, wouldn't work as well in Syria. You don't have a big desert. You don't have an overwhelming role for air power in a cities war like this. The worst thing we could do, and this is the hard part and the tricky part, as Anne-Marie said, these are very, very brave people. But we don't want to give them the impression that we have a solution, that we're going to come save them and make additional people go out and risk their lives and risk the kind of torture that we're seeing when our options are so limited. All we can really do is cause economic and political pain on the regime.
To go back in history a little bit,
Exactly.
where you speak and then you don't follow through. But Anne-Marie, then, is the takeaway for the Arab leadership, then, that the more brutal the dictator, the more likely he or she is, I guess he in this context, obviously, to be able to stand up to all the words that emanate from the State Department, and all those words don't amount to anything if you are sufficiently brutal and you can just wait us out? That is not the message we want the rest of the world to take away from our response to the Arab Spring.
I don't think that's the message we're sending, and it's not true that we've done nothing. We have actually imposed sanctions against top government officials, including President Assad. We've worked with the EU to do that. We're tightening those sanctions. We are doing what we can economically, and above all, in terms of diplomatic isolation. And there are other things we can do in terms of going to the Security Council, asking for condemnation of this behavior, asking for the world community to impose those sanctions. But if you look at it, the most violent, which has thus far been Gaddafi, actually has military power being used against him. In Yemen, you have an active regional intervention. In Syria, you've got diplomatic measures against, whereas, of course, in Tunisia and in Egypt, actually, there's individual accountability, like, say, for Mubarak. But the country's progress is going forward. So I don't think it's true that you get the message that you can just do whatever with impunity. But I do think there are these governments that have said we'd rather shoot than leave power, and we don't know how those games are going to, they're not games, how those situations will end.
I disagree with you only to the very limited extent. I think it's a fair debate whether Assad or Gaddafi is more revolting in terms of their abuse of power. Put that reasonably small issue aside in the context of history. I guess the takeaway is we are not omnipotent. Consistency will never be possible in these multiple and very difficult and subtle contexts, and you do what you can do. Jamie, 10 seconds to the last word.
That's the key thing. Where you can make a difference,
right,
you got to try to do it and show them that we're on their side, but not put them in more danger.
So the lack of consistency doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, but you can't say that we're not omnipotent, therefore we do nothing.
Everything, so that doesn't mean we should do nothing.
All right. Anne-Marie Slaughter,
but we honor the people.
Jamie Rubin, thank you so much for being with us. We want to have you back on the show. This is a story that, unfortunately, is continuing. Thank you both. Up next, a top Republican